Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world. Now we are going to have a quite interesting session on international humanitarian law, how this is applied to non-state armed groups, and how this international humanitarian law can contribute to pave the road for peace. My name is Rodolfo Rossi. I'm an epidemiologist. I work as a research methodology advisor at the Center of Operational Research and Experience at the ICRC. Today, we are joined by two distinguished speakers from the ICRC. First of all, I would like to thank also Matei and the IFRC for this technical support they are going to provide us. Before I present the speaker and we start with the presentation, some housekeeping. Why my screen doesn't move? Do you see my slide moving? No, eh? No. So I think I stop share a moment and restart again. See, nothing moves. Huh. Okay. So the slides are moving now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, okay. So some housekeeping first. Sorry for the technical issues. So please put your name when you join the meeting. Mute your microphone and keep your video on if you want to, unless you have low connectivity. We will have the two sessions, and then we propose that we have all the question afterwards. So you can put the question in the chat box, or at the end you can raise your hand. We will try to solve any ICT issues. We will try our best, and then the session is going to be recorded, and we ask not to take screenshots or picture of the participants. This session can be translated with artificial intelligence caption. So here you can see, you can go on the caption and choose the language, and you will have automatically some subtitles. So, as I said, we have two honorable speakers today that I will present. In a moment. Ariana and Tilman, that they both work at the Law and Policy Department at the ICRC. So, we start with Ariana. Ariana Lopez Morey is a policy advisor in the ICRC Policy and Research Division in Geneva. Ariana has worked in the humanitarian sector for 15 years in various roles in both in the field and headquarters, including 7 years at the ICRC. She has led the development of the ICRC institutional gender, diversity and inclusion policy, and has previously led research and publication on subjects including protracted conflict and humanitarian action, food security, and gender and humanitarian principle. Before joining the ICRC, Ariana worked with Médecins Sans Frontières, the International Criminal Court, and the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. Ariana holds a Master in International Humanitarian Action and a Bachelor degree in Peace and Conflict Studies. Ariana, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'll try to keep it to about 15 minutes before passing to Tillman so we can keep some time at the end for questions. And today I'm going to speak about some research that was conducted by the policy unit here in Geneva on humanitarian action and peace, the connections between the two, with a focus, of course, on ICRC's operational experience and historical experience. Next slide, please. I wanted to start by just making a note about why the ICRC undertook this research. And I'm just going to speak about it, no problem, Rodolfo, while you work on the slides. I'm sorry, it's technical difficulties as usual. There's always something like that on this kind of call. So just to speak about why the ICRC undertook this research, really it stems from our analysis, which some of you might be familiar with because some of it's laid out in the 2024 Challenges report. Just noting that the ICRC's classified approximately 120 armed conflicts last year. And we've also assessed that these conflicts are more complex and fragmented. They are more protracted. They're harder to end. So a lot of conflicts are not actually ending through negotiated or military solutions. And of course, the main interest for us here is that it's causing enormous human suffering. And the ICRC's assessment is really that in the face of this growing humanitarian impacts, a sort of business as usual humanitarian approach to simply try to respond to those humanitarian needs isn't sufficient. And that as an institution with a strong moral voice, there's a need to make a sort of humanitarian call for peace and to consider what is the role of all actors in the in the international community to contribute to the possibilities for peace, including the ICRC. And so we wanted to reflect on what is the ICRC's role in that space, what are the possible contributions and the limitations to its contributions when it comes to peace. Next slide, please. So the questions that we wanted to answer were, in what ways does the ICRC contribute to an environment conducive to peace? And how can the ICRC better leverage and strengthen those contributions with the interest of mitigating and reducing the human suffering that results? A quick note on the language, we were very particular about using the phrase contributing to an environment conducive to peace, or alternatively contributing to the prospects for peace, to really make it clear that the ICRC is not and will not become a peace building organization. So contributing to peace will not be the primary objective of the ICRC. However, just acknowledging, especially in contexts where we're present for many decades, we do have an impact on the broader political, social, economic environment in the countries where we're working. And there will be an impact on the sort of peace building environment. And we'd like to make sure that that impact is as much as possible a positive one rather than a negative one, and see how to strengthen it. Next slide, please. So on the methodology, just briefly, we started with an open source literature review looking at both academic and practitioner literature. First, looking at the concept and definition of peace, which of course is not settled. So there's no sort of universally accepted definition of peace, but just looking at the many concepts that have been presented over time. As well as practitioner literature that tried to look at how to measure contributions to peace. So how do other humanitarian organizations or development organizations or mediation actors measure their contributions to peace according to their own theory of change or definitions and concepts that they're using. And we use that to sort of frame our own approach to this research. We also looked specifically at the ICRC's archives and more historical examples of operational practice, as well as movement documents and assessing how the movement as a whole, the ICRC included, has engaged with the concept of peace, the tension between humanitarian contributions to peace and the limitations to that over time. And I'll speak a bit about that in the findings. And then we did some contemporary operational research last year, primarily looking at 3 contexts, which we hoped gave a good sort of representative sample of very different types of contexts in terms of the phase of conflict and the nature of conflict. So Northern Ireland, which is largely considered post-conflict, Colombia, where you have ongoing non-international armed conflicts, but you also have a peace accord, a really important peace accord from 2016, which is being implemented, and then Yemen, which is currently experiencing, of course, armed conflict as well, but where there is not a peace accord, but a peace process or efforts towards peace that have been initiated and where ICRC has played a role. Next slide, please. And just a note on the methodology in terms of the operational research. We again looked at some literature in terms of the concept of peace specific to these country contexts, because peace, of course, is very subjective, and it's important to consider the concept of peace specific to the conflict you're assessing. So we did a literature review for that. And then looking at the ICRC's contribution, we conducted primary research, primarily interviews and focus group discussions with a variety of community members, civil society actors, movement actors, other agencies, politicians, academics, and more, depending on who was relevant in the context that we were visiting. And I can speak about that if people have questions. In the countries themselves, we were looking again at how peace was understood in that context, and then specifically how ICRC's work could contribute to that concept of peace, bearing in mind what we took as ICRC's own definition, which is the definition from the movement statutes. So as a component of the movement, we took the definition that comes from the statutes in the description of the principle of humanity, actually. Next slide, please. So in terms of the findings, just to speak a bit about the movement assessment that we did in terms of the historical approach to engaging with peace, we found it really interesting. This is not a new subject, of course. Many of you probably know this. But over the last 100 years, there's been more than 90 resolutions passed, either at the Council of Delegates or the International Conference, which speak either directly or indirectly to peace. The most direct resolutions are those. There's a whole series of resolutions speaking about the Red Cross as a factor of world peace. And actually, the most recent one was passed just last year at the Council of Delegates on October. But in addition to those, there's a number of resolutions that look at other subjects and their connection to peace, such as human rights or the fight against racial discrimination, disarmament, other subjects that are also spoken about in connection to peace in the content of the resolutions. Some of the most interesting for us were the resolutions that articulate a mandate for the ICRC to contribute to the prevention or resolution of conflict. And the most famous and probably most well known is this one from 1965, from the 20th International Conference in Vienna, which encouraged the ICRC to undertake, in liaison with the UN and in the framework of its mission, every effort likely to contribute to the prevention or settlement of possible armed conflicts, and to be associated with states with their agreement with any measures, appropriate measures to that end. And this was passed in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the role that the ICRC had been prepared to play to help resolve that and prevent what was considered to be a very high risk of nuclear confrontation. And it was sort of validating that that was the right decision for the ICRC, although at the time it was the subject of quite a lot of debate, as you can imagine. There are a few other resolutions that sort of reaffirmed this mandate for the ICRC going forward, but this is the most, I think, famous. We also looked at some research into peace agreements between 1934 and 2024 to look for mentions of the ICRC and other movement actors. And we found that actually over 150 peace agreements or other peace documents specifically mentioned the ICRC in that time frame. And national societies were mentioned in about 20 such documents, usually the national society specific to the context where the conflict was taking place. And we found that interesting because it sort of is a reflection of the acknowledgement that humanitarian actors play an important contribution to the environment in which peace is going to be built once the agreement is made, or an agreement to make efforts for peace. And again, happy to speak more about that afterwards if there are questions. Next slide, please. In terms of, broadly speaking, the humanitarian contribution to peace, we conceptualized it this way as a sort of hypothesis and felt that it was really well supported by the research that we did. So broadly speaking, there are three ways in which humanitarians, the ICRC specifically, work, and the ways in which peace is built. And those are, first, at the community level, work that can contribute to social cohesion or strengthening the social fabric during and in the aftermath of conflict. And that really usually means working with a strong conflict sensitivity lens and trying to do no harm in the sense of not exacerbating conflict dynamics through your humanitarian programming at the community level. But sometimes there are examples where actors, including the ICRC, can use specific tools to do what they can to contribute positively to actually strengthening and improving social cohesion and reducing tensions between communities. So that intersects well with grassroots peace building efforts usually. A second area of work is facilitating humanitarian dialogue or influencing political authorities to keep humanitarian concerns in mind when they are negotiating either informal peace talks and processes or outside of those processes when they're just developing policies to address humanitarian concerns in their own country. Keeping humanitarian concerns in mind is important to make sure that those are addressed and don't become obstacles to reconciliation down the line. So ICRC's neutral intermediary work is important at this level, but it's not the only type of work that we looked at there. And then in the third area of work, we were looking at promoting respect for laws, norms, and institutions, I should have written here, because there's a strong correlation in the research between respect for the law and institution strengthening or having effective and accountable institutions in place. Those correlate strongly to peace in the literature. And so the ICRC's efforts to promote an understanding of and respect for international humanitarian law and help capacity building of institutions and technical capacity even for institutions that are working to implement the law and also implement, for example, peace accords. That's an important contribution that can be made as well. Next slide, please. So looking specifically at the case studies, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what we found. In Northern Ireland, as I mentioned, it's a post-conflict society after the Good Friday Agreement. However, a really huge amount of inter-community division still exists, a lot of fear, distrust, and even physical violence leading to death. So the ICRC in about 2011 did a sort of a rapid needs assessment and determined that there was still a gap there and a need for a humanitarian actor like the ICRC to make a positive contribution. And so an office was opened and humanitarian programs were initiated primarily to support community mediators to give them a sort of humanitarian mediation toolkit, language and approach, and also to convene and hold a neutral space that those actors felt comfortable and safe to attend so that they could directly negotiate between themselves either the risk of violence or violence that was already breaking out in order to mitigate and reduce it. And there were really important examples of success there in terms of establishing and maintaining dialogue between these groups and success in reducing or mitigating violence and even saving lives is what people had said to us. So this is quite small scale work, but really relevant work that we found interesting to look at. And a couple of quotes from interviewees that I wanted to share here were just that ICRC was seen as an honest broker between parties, which is interesting language because that's often language used when you're speaking about mediators. And that the humanitarian principles are really what gave the ICRC its value in bringing this methodology to the groups. And one of the mediators himself mentioned that he had really black and white views when he started the program, speaking about himself and his views of the other community groups, but he felt it was valuable to practice the humanitarian mediation because he saw that it got results and that using the principles and looking for the good in the other actually not only felt like the right thing, but it led to real results that he appreciated. Next slide, please. So Colombia is a country that I'm sure many people are familiar with. It's spoken about a lot when it comes to investigations on peace and peace building, as well as humanitarian action. The ICRC, of course, had a significant role supporting negotiations for the 2016 peace accord, including support to the negotiation on specific humanitarian topics, including the sort of demobilization of child soldiers and addressing the issue of the missing. In addition to that, it's had a very important role with the implementation of that peace accord. So it has supported the three major institutions that were created by the peace accord. So the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Unit for the Search for Missing People, and the third one I'm blanking on right now, I want to say the Victims Unit, which is from actually a past peace accord. I will come back to it. But just to say, it's had a strong role in providing technical and other support, legal support for the jurists who are working in the special jurisdiction for peace, et cetera, to support their establishment, their functioning, and their ability to reach communities across Colombia, because ICRC has a really important physical presence across most of the territory that most other actors don't have. And one of the things that Colombian authorities mentioned was ICRC knows the country and the issues of the people better than we do, because we often don't get outside of Bogota, but you can bring that voice to us, and it's really important for us to be informed about the ongoing impacts. In addition to that, the ICRC has helped to establish IHL as a relevant framework for conversation on some of the humanitarian issues that are being dealt with in current peace negotiations with existing non-state armed groups that with whom there is no peace agreement right now, but who have shown a willingness to come to a negotiating table with the government. And we can speak about that. I don't want to go on too long. I feel like I'm already taking a bit too much time. So just to say some of the reflections from colleagues or from interviewees we spoke to in Colombia were that the notion of peace became about recognizing the dignity of the individual, which was a shift for Colombia from the 70s and 80s, where it was more focused on the enforcement of the rule of law by the state. And when it became about the dignity of the individual, that's where humanitarianism became so important and why ICRC had such an important role for the process. And one Colombian civil servant mentioned that when we talk of peace, the population really needs to feel like I wasn't alone. I was not ignored, I was accompanied, and that is what the ICRC is able to provide through its humanitarian programming and through establishing the reach of Colombian institutions into territories that they wouldn't otherwise be able to reach without that support. Next slide, please. So the last case is Yemen. ICRC had a role with the Prisoner Exchange Agreement, which is one of three aspects of the Stockholm Agreement from 2018. And it was considered, or it was hoped that it would act as a confidence building mechanism between the parties. So the ICRC wasn't involved in the proposal of establishing this agreement, but once it was agreed, and that was promoted by the Office of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General of Yemen, once there was agreement between parties to look at a prisoner exchange agreement and to start working on that, ICRC was invited to help with the implementation to ensure that that agreement would actually produce results. So the ICRC's involvement was shown to have increased the parties' trust that the mechanism had value, that coming to the table to negotiate an agreement like this was worthwhile because, yes, it would produce results. And that's because it has led to two large-scale release operations, as well as quite a number of unilateral release operations done on the margins of the two major releases. Those were really hard won. I don't want to minimize how hard it was to come to the agreement on those release operations, but the fact that they took place was really meaningful for Yemenis that we spoke to and for colleagues from the Office of the Special Envoy. They mentioned that it was really symbolically important for the parties to sit together there, that the release operations did give hope and ease suffering, which was, of course, their primary objective and the reason why ICRC wanted to participate in that for a humanitarian purpose, and that the releases were a way of showing that parties could work together and that delivering is possible on other issues as well. Um, next slide, please. So just to finish up, to mention two things that are a little bit contradictory. So one is to again reiterate that we do see that there's a humanitarian imperative to contribute to the prospects for peace, considering just the scale of human suffering, the potential to use the ICRC's moral voice to speak about the need to reinvest in conflict resolution mechanisms. And we did want to explore the way that ICRC contributes, but we want to be clear that humanitarians are not responsible for, creating or maintaining peace, that requires political will. And so part of the work that we'd like to do is not just show what humanitarians or what the ICRC can do, but also really make a strong call for states to reinvest in respect for the law, including IHL, and in conflict prevention and resolution mechanisms. And the global initiative that was initiated recently is a big part of that work, of course, as well. I did appreciate this quote, though, from one of the interviewees we spoke to in Northern Ireland, who said that peace is a continuum. The fire might be out, but the embers need to be dampened. And there's a duty of care to the future that humanitarians need to acknowledge. So in his view, he was just saying that, of course, humanitarians see a large distinction between their own work and peace work, but there is a potential to see the duty of care to contribute as much as is possible within the scope of the mandate to the prospects for peace, and making sure that the humanitarian programming that's undertaken is done intentionally to ideally support the efforts for peace and to ensure that it won't make a negative contribution or exacerbate conflict in a country. That's it from my side. Thank you so much. And I'm assuming we'll do questions at the end and we'll pass to Tillman, but please let me know, Rodolfo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ariana. Very interesting. We will pass the question later. In the meantime, it's blocked again. Sorry again. Managed to move on a bit. So now I'm going to introduce Tilman Rodenhauser, who is a legal advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. Tillman is the ICRC legal expert on non-state armed groups. Tillman holds a PhD in international law from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. Is the author of the monograph Organizing Rebellion, Non-State Armed Groups and the International Humanitarian Law, Human Rights Law, and International Criminal Law, published in 2018 from the Oxford University Press, if I'm not mistaken, Tillman, isn't it? He also published various articles in renowned international journals and received several awards for his publication. Tillman today is going to talk to us about application of IHL with non-state armed groups. Tillman, I pass the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rodolfo. And colleagues, it's a real pleasure to join you at this Red Cross Red Crescent Research Consortium and to speak here about some of the research that we do at the ICRC. You've heard from Ariana on humanitarian work and peace. I will speak more specifically on research that we do about the engagement with armed groups, in particular on humanitarian law, but also its implementation and our protection work. And so what I have prepared for today is 3 points. I first want to embed the research in our operational reality, so briefly say what is the reality we're seeing and why we do such research, then introduce 2 research projects to you, and in a third point also say a few words about methodological challenges that might be particular to us in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. So here you have the first slide. What is the reality? You've heard from Ariana that we have over 120 armed conflicts today in the world. About 100 of them are non-international. That means we have at least one non-state armed group involved. And I say at least one because, in fact, the ICRC considers about 120 non-state armed groups to be parties to such armed conflict. So that's a huge number. The ICRC, as you know, engages with all sides to an armed conflict, and that means that we have a long-standing tradition, and we have a long-standing practice of engaging with non-state armed groups, and that's often very concrete humanitarian work. It may mean we visit detainees in the hands of non-state armed groups to care for their well-being, to facilitate their contact to families, as Ariana just said, to work as a neutral intermediary in release operations, but also very significantly simply to deliver humanitarian relief to persons living under the control of non-state armed groups. And there are 200 million people today who live under the influence or control of non-state armed groups today. As a legal advisor, the one aspect of that work that is particularly relevant to me is engagement with armed groups on international humanitarian law, either through dialogue on the actual conduct of the group or through trainings on international humanitarian law. And that's actually a significant amount of what our delegations in the field do. It's not so much what comes out to the public or even what we share within the movement, because a lot of that is really done in confidence. But as of last year, we speak to 270 different armed groups around the world, and to about a third of them, so 90 to 100, we speak either about what we call protection work, so their conduct vis-a-vis persons under their control, and also international humanitarian law. And that leads me to my second point, Rodolfo, if you change slides. The second point is, among the long-standing areas that the ICRC has been working on probably for centuries. And what we are mandated for in the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols is, on the one hand, the work to protect detainees, and on the other hand, the work to restore family links, to find missing people, and in that respect also to work on the protection of the dead. And this is what we also do with non-state armed groups. And so these are the two research projects that I want to talk today about. One is, we call it non-state armed groups and detention, international humanitarian law, and examples of how it has been implemented. And the second is quite similar. It is non-state armed groups and the separated, missing, and dead, similarly IHL obligations and ways to implement them. If I zoom a little bit in on the detention part, today the ICRC believes that there are 70 groups holding detainees, so it's a significant amount. And when we look at it operationally, as a legal advisor, I often get questions about, is that at all lawful under IHL? And what are the obligations of non-state armed groups if they hold detainees? And in any case, how can they implement them? They're armed groups that might be very diverse and might not have much capacity. So we get very practical questions about their conduct. On the legal side, it's often not so hard to answer them, because we just look to the law and see what the law says about it. But what's really, I think, at the core of it is, how can that be operationalized? How can it be implemented in very diverse contexts around the world? And at the ICRC, what is really rich is we have so many colleagues who work every day on such subjects. It has a vast amount of knowledge and expertise, but it is hard to harvest this. It's hard to bring that together and to have everyone in the organization benefit from that. So what we've done in both of these research projects is, on the one hand, the legal advisors brought together the law. So what do the Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, and customary law say about the protection of detainees, the missing, the dead, the separated? But I think then, much more interestingly, actually, we have looked at how has this been implemented by non-state armed groups. And for this, methodologically, we've looked at what has the ICRC seen when visiting detainees or when being on the ground trying to restore family links. For this, as Ariana as well, we've gone to the archives, and we've seen in different contexts what do we find from our archives of practices of armed groups. We've looked in simply our operational documents. What do we hear every day from places such as Yemen or Colombia? We've spoken to different armed groups for detention. It was about 15 different groups that we had a questionnaire and asked, how do they ensure that they allow detainees to contact families? How do they prevent torture? How do they, what fair trial guarantees do they have in place if they were to conduct trials for armed groups? So very practical questions. And we looked at armed group doctrines. Many have codes of conduct or policy documents. And so we analyzed them systematically. And based on this, and you will have a pictures, I'll show you pictures of that in the last slide, we came out with one report that brings together the law together with operational practices of what groups have done in practice. And let me give you an example. What we find there is really not rocket science or new theory, but often very practical things. All of you will be aware that torture is prohibited outside armed conflict, in armed conflict. At the same time, we see operationally that is much too often torture is committed. And when we spoke to armed groups and their commanders of how it can effectively be prevented, it was actually very clear and almost simple what commanders told us, what they believe is essential for their troops to comply with the prohibition of torture. It's first, it must be known to the troops. So there need to be very clear obligations, ideally in an internal document of the group, so a code of conduct. That must be known to the fighters, so they need to be trained on it. They need to be reminded of it. Some commanders would say before every battle, they would remind the groups of the basic rules. And there need to be consequences for violations of these rules. So on the one hand, oversight by a commander, but then also punishment for those who violate these rules. And so this is the kind of, this one example of what you find in these studies, but you literally have that for all relevant rules on detention. And hopefully by the end of this year, we will also publish similar research on how armed groups have avoided family separations and how they have worked on finding missing relatives and how they treated the dead. That brings me to my third slide. And this is somewhat challenges that we encounter when we do such kind of research. The key one, and that I find very tricky, is much of the information that we rely on, be it from our operations, archives, or confidential dialogue, including interviews, we can't attribute. We can't say, now I just pick one. We can't say, oh, we heard this from an armed group in Colombia, or we heard that. This is how an armed group in Yemen or anywhere else in the world did this or that. We can't attribute that, usually because either it comes from confidential dialogue, or also because if we want to have future engagement with those same parties or with their enemies, we can't either say something bad or good about them in public. So it is very hard then to find the right way of, on the one hand, being scientifically solid, of proving where information comes from and having proper footnotes and credibility about what we say, but at the same time protecting our operational dialogue. And here, what we've done in the end is that where we cite practices, we don't attribute them to specific contexts or groups, but we say whether we have observed that with one, a few, or many armed groups, on which continents and in which years, and somewhat what kind of armed group that was. Was it a group that is just a fighting group that might be operating remotely, or is it a group that actually controls territory in a very stable manner and almost acts like a state? The second point is the diversity of armed groups. When you think about what I just said, we have some groups, there might literally only be a few hundred fighters that hide in a remote area of a country, but then we have others, they look like states, they control vast amount of territory and populations with institutions and really could be states if they were recognized as such. And so the question is, how do we present practices that relate to both of them? I guess one point on this is a legal one, that all parties to non-international armed conflict have the same obligations. Sometimes there is a nuance in these obligations depending on capacity, but even on an obligation that doesn't have a nuance on capacity, still what we found is they can be implemented in very different ways. And to give you an example, when you think about the obligation to allow detainees to correspond with families, there's no way around it. It's a hard obligation, it must be done. But the way it is done is really different from one context to the other. So we've found that in practice, armed groups have allowed detainees to write letters, sometimes to do phone calls, to send text messages. We've seen emails, we had video calls, and of course, in many contexts, the very least that can be done is a Red Cross, Red Crescent message. So you see even in a hard obligation, there are probably 7 different ways of implement it according to what is feasible. But that's also an important point. In the end, we present different practices, but these different practices need to be nuanced to the context and the group. So in the end, it is on the humanitarian that uses it, on the armed groups that uses it, or the state that uses such practices in dialogue with armed groups to tailor the recommendation and the implementation practice to the capacity of the group. Because of course, a group with very sophisticated capacities may be able to allow video calls, which other groups that operate in a remote area with no connectivities could not do. This brings me to my final slide, which I think, what for me is almost the most important. At the ICRC, even though we present here a few research projects, I think that research is rather rare because it's often what the ICRC does is very operationally driven, and so such research, I find it incredibly important, but it often comes on top. But at the same time, it is incredibly valuable to have that kind of research and to have it done. And here I want to give you a few examples of how research that is done over years and with significant effort can then translate into operational practices. So from this work on what we did with armed groups and detention, we came out with 3 products. One was a comprehensive report, a thick document with a lot of practices. Then a small pocket card, very thin, very lean, can be handed out to groups very easily. And a video where you see a screenshot here on the right that is shared either via YouTube, or it's publicly accessible, but can also be shared, of course, via phones. And once we produce that, what is the beauty or the importance of doing that with the Red Cross Red Crescent movement is that afterwards it is translated into operational practice. For instance, on the report, the most recent example I heard is there was a group with that contact the ICRC because they had wounded detainees and didn't know what to do with these wounded soldiers in their hands and what their obligations are, and especially what can they practically do. And what our delegation was doing is they actually took the report, extracted the different ways that other armed groups have dealt with similar situations, and based on that could give that armed group very concrete and practice-based examples of what can be done. The pocket card, which is the second example of what you have, is literally the 15 most important rules or the 15 protections of detainees that we consider most important. What our delegations do with that, it's translated in several languages, and it's often, as soon as we remind armed groups of their legal obligations, in some contexts, we also give them exactly that little pocket card. So to remind them of the concrete obligations they have to detainees and make this easily shareable also with their fighters. And the third one is a video, and that I think works particularly well in contexts where maybe written products don't work so well because some groups might be illiterate, or also where young people like us, they're more open to looking at videos and watching on their screen. And so some of our delegations have translated that into relevant languages and then started sharing such videos, even via WhatsApp with relevant groups, so to reach the right people. And this shows to me that if in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement we do operational research and with the view to producing relevant results, then this often has an impact in our operations. And I stop here.
Thank you, Tilman. Thank you. We'll share this slide just afterwards. But in the meantime, let's see if there are some questions. Matei, do you see any questions in the chat? Well, if not, I do have questions for you guys. Ariana, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask you, were there any negative contribution to the prospect for peace identified by the study, or negative impacts that the ICRC involvement in peace efforts in the cases that were studied?
Thanks, Rodolfo. And it's a good question. I don't remember if I mentioned in the presentation, but we did go into the research, specifically keeping an open mind to potential negative impacts. So it was part of our interviews with the community members or agencies, academics, et cetera, other groups, to specifically ask also about potential negative impacts that they saw. Happily, there weren't any specific negative impacts. Mainly what people spoke to us about when we asked that question was around the limitations to what ICRC can do to contribute positively, if that makes sense. So the places where they felt that there was room for ICRC to do even more, given our usually trusted role between the parties and the mechanisms that were already in place that were working well. They often saw areas where further support could have been useful to go even further and make a stronger contribution to peace. And there was a good understanding of why the ICRC wasn't doing that in most cases, because there were clear reasons around, usually to do with neutrality or independence, around why we weren't comfortable to do that. But the main limitation people spoke of was there rather than of a negative contribution per se.
Thank you, Ariana. And Tilman, from the ICRC research on the roots of restraint in war that was conducted a few years ago, we understand that to influence the behavior of non-state groups, reliance on AHL alone is not as strong as relying on AHL and the cultural and religious values and rules that underpin the law. We understand your research projects aim to influence non-state armed group behavior. Have you consider the finding of the root of restraints, and if yes, how?
Gosh, that's a complicated one. What you just quoted from the roots of restraint, that engagement on IHL alone can never be as strong as engagement on IHL together with the values that it underpins. That for me is almost one of the most important results from that, because it gives us a good hint on how, even as IHL lawyers, but more broadly as a humanitarian organization, we can make these norms resonate. And probably the most concrete way, or how we use that finding with regard to the research I've just presented, is particularly with regard to Islamic law. I think at the ICRC, a huge amount of our operations, I think it's more than half of our operations take place in Muslim majority countries, simply because that's where many of the armed conflicts today unfortunately are. And in these contexts, we have, of course, a lot of jihadist armed groups. Some of them are perfectly agree with humanitarian law and consider it relevant. There are other groups that don't, and they think it's man-made law. Some think it's ICRC Red Cross law, and some of them simply only go by Islamic law, so have this as their primary reference framework, their primary restraint framework. And so in order to reach those groups, what we have at the ICRC is an Islamic law expert, and this is Professor Al-Dawoodi. And with him, we have taken the IHL rules that we did, for instance, on the protection of detainees, or that we identified on protection of detainees, and he has identified the Islamic law sources for exactly these same principles. And so today in our operations, we have documents that show the humanitarian law obligations together with the Islamic law obligations. And so when we engage with jihadi groups or groups that have primarily Islamic law as their reference, we can also rely on Islamic law to in the end pass the same protection messages. And I think that is where I would say we build on this research from the roots of restraint and try to really have that as part and parcel of our humanitarian work also with these research projects.
Thank you, Tilman. We have a question for both of you. If we have time, if you are very quick, because the Zoom will allow us for another 3 minutes and no more. When discussing the topic of IHL and peace in the context of non-international armed conflict or with non-state armed groups, compared to discussing it with the context of international armed conflict or with states, what do you think are the main differences and challenges?
Can take a shot at, or just begin, and then, and Tillman, I'm happy to have your thoughts on this. Maybe not speaking specifically about IHL and peace, but humanitarian action and peace, including IHL, and actually picking up on what Tillman was just explaining. We also saw in our research that remains true, the finding from the roots of restraint. So to say that speaking about IHL obligations alone is certainly not as effective as speaking about cultural norms or religious norms or humanitarian principles. And we saw that specifically in Yemen for sure, where a dialogue based more around the principles rather than legal obligations was really effective. And in terms of the contribution to peace, I think that's important because the correlation, I think we feel the correlation is there between respect for humanitarian principles, and when it comes down to respect and promotion of human dignity, that's a fundamental contribution to peace in our view. And the way it's manifested can be around strengthening respect for laws and institutions and norms, or allowing access to humanitarian assistance for populations under the control of a given group, etc. But I think the reliance on humanitarian principles and cultural norms or religious norms, like Tillman was explaining, is really valuable and important, particularly with sometimes non-state armed groups, though with states as well, I think. I'm not sure. Tillman, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are twofold. I think especially when we look at IHL and here what you have, we have obligations in relation to detainees and also their release. You have obligations in relation to missing and dead people, and they're not similar, but they're fairly some of the same issues come into play in international, non-international armed conflict, and so in both types of conflict, these implementation of such obligations can help building bridges towards peace, and so here. Of course, the obligations are different, but I see similar mechanisms. When I recently spoke to a person from an armed group who has been involved in peace process, what she emphasized, and I found that interesting, is in international armed conflict, afterwards, two countries have to live kind of next to each other in peace. In non-international armed conflict, enemies have to live in one country in one society. And this is a huge difference because usually it's not only about ending violence, but it will also be about resolving the underlying grudges and grievances. And from what I understood from that person is that this tends to be left aside. And so there might be peace, but the underlying conflicts and the core reasons for the violence might remain. And this is then, of course, a particular challenge because it risks erupting again.
Thank you, Tilman. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ariana. Thank you, Tilman. You brought a really good perspective on international humanitarian law in various with some very good examples. The time is finished. I just want to share a QR code in case you want to give a feedback on this session. I thank you all for your participation and this morning, and I wish you again a good morning, good evening, a good night, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Have a nice day.